and we're going to be staying in the context right away. And I try to use a term that Marta crafted. We're trying to stay within flight control. And the first roundtable for today that I am pleased to moderate right now is on how to draft the governance of blockchain applications. And for that, I would like to ask Emmanuel Ganne, Chesip Lee, Jared Koopman, and Yelena Madir to come on stage. For the sake of content versus form, I'm just going to tell that Emmanuel Ganne is the senior analyst and blockchain lead at the WTO. Jasip is the director of Telecommunications Standardization Bureau of the ITU. Jared is the director of cybercrime at the US IRS. And Yelena is the general counsel at the Vaccine Alliance. I'll skip through their CVs, which are all impressive, and just trust me by saying that they know how to throw the ball really far. So, with that said, I think it's going to be much more interesting to listen to what they have to say. And the CVs, you can just find them on the net. So, thank you, all of you, for being with us. So let's start with the first question. The title of this panel assumes positively that governance is needed for blockchain technology and its respective applications. May I ask each of the panelists to quickly argue, applying one's professional lens, as to why governance is actually needed? Yelena, you want to start?
Okay, well, in
It's
it is
working.
working. Okay, great. So in the blockchain context, we all know that we have a number of players. We have the core group that's responsible for the design of the code. We have a number of nodes that are operating blockchain for purposes of validation. We have users such as hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, financial services companies, and we have those third parties that are affected by blockchain. Now, in the permissionless blockchain in particular, as we know, a number of nodes will not necessarily know the identity of other nodes. And that begs the question of, against whom the redress will be sought if things go wrong. And in particular, when we talk about open source software, who is going to be responsible for erroneous messages, for defects in the code, for bugs in the operating system? Another question that, at least from the legal perspective, is very relevant when we think about governance is what kinds of relationships are those? Are these contractual relationships? In the permissionless blockchain, very unlikely that we will have written contracts that spell out the different responsibilities, which again begs the question, okay, are there any tortious duties of care that responsibilities that attach? And people can, policymakers and lawmakers can be thinking about, okay, perhaps we just let losses lie where they fall. However, that might not be desirable if we're talking about consumers. And again, not insurmountable, unsolvable questions, but something that needs to be thought through. And I would think that policymakers and lawmakers would need to walk themselves through various scenarios and see where losses lie, and are we comfortable with the outcome. In particular, are we comfortable with losses attaching just to the direct losses, or is liability going to attach to perhaps even indirect losses, such as the securities transaction didn't get registered, and therefore I wasn't able to launch a takeover bid, for example. Is the loss going to go beyond the direct loss or also indirect loss? Answers will vary across jurisdictions, which also begs another question: what is the governing law? And cross-border transactions are nothing new. However, in the context of blockchain, determining the place of business, the place of the location of the asset, and place of performance can be quite tricky, again, particularly in the permissionless blockchain context.
Thank you so much. Jared, what is your take?
Yeah, thank you, and good morning. So, coming from a government standpoint and law enforcement specific, I think one thing to consider is the speed at which blockchain has started to develop. I think a really good governance and body to that really takes time, and that's one thing that we don't have in this space. I mean, the tech companies have already dictated the speed of which things are changing and so rapidly that we have to understand that we have to keep pace. So in order to build something from a governance standpoint, we really feel that it has to be contained with structure, information control, that authenticity that keeps popping up. That's a huge factor from a law enforcement perspective, simply because of the understanding that we have to enable the folks that are going to be overseeing the proper use of this technology to make sure that they're able to use the information that's yielding. And I think that that gives to understanding that we still want to allow innovation, we want to allow conflict of interest and resolution, but understanding that transparency has to be there. And from my sense, a majority of our job centers around making attribution and allowing us to understand who's behind some of these transactions. The tech companies have, in this space, have really controlled not only financial transactions, but media and communication along with it. And that brings a lot of big responsibility. And it's just understanding that environment to make sure it's done correctly.
Thank you so much. Emmanuel, what is your take?
So I work on international trade. International trade is highly complex. It involves many players. Yelena mentioned the number of players that can be involved when it comes to blockchain. When it comes to international trade, you have importers, exporters, you have shippers, you have the trade finance dimension. All these people have to work together, but they don't necessarily trust each other. And blockchain can have a huge impact on international trade and remove frictions. And what we've seen over the past few years is the emergence of a number of consortia with players who are competitors, but actually work together, try to leverage the potential of the technology to remove frictions from international trade. But consortia are very complex animals and they're very difficult to govern. The technology is just a tool. You do need to have a governance structure that is well thought in order to determine the rights and obligations of each stakeholder, of each player, so that you create trust, you encourage cooperation, a term that is very often used in the context of consortia. And here we're talking more about permission blockchains rather than permissionless blockchains that were mentioned earlier. Is co-petition. But co-petition requires a framework, it requires rules. And so drafting a governance of these consortia is critical. And when I speak to actors from these different consortia, they all say governance is actually one of our key challenges, and we don't even really know how to go about it. There are different ways of going about it. A couple of months ago, I published a white paper with Dipesh Patel of Trade Finance Global, where we tried to map the different initiatives that have been taken in the field of mainly trade finance and transportation and logistics in relation to international trade. And governance was one of the key concerns, one of the key challenges that came out of the survey that we did. So yes, it's critical to have governance and to design it properly and to really think about these issues early on.
Thank you so much. Jason, what's your take?
Very good morning to you all. Welcome to Geneva. I work in the ITU. ITU is the International Telecommunication Union. We are mainly based on the ICT technology standard development. Let me try to, in addition of what you said, or that's all previous speakers, the amazing nature of decentralized of this blockchain is bring us to building trust. It's used for many other industry cross sectors. Major key point was building trust. Trust doesn't mean everything is done by ourselves. We definitely know we are quite to ensure this blockchain is give us many benefits, but we have to also respect already existing institutions like central bank, government. Trust is need something to ensure this part. Another technical part is the security and the data privacy. How we can ensure this, especially taking into account of this, blockchain is now used many industry sectors, vertical sectors. So it's becoming more foundational technologies. So this is becoming subject for security and data privacy. Finally, is interoperability issue. Now, many different blockchains and the platforms is working now. How we can interoperate all those different blockchains. We know this federated, definitely decentralized, but we understand if we can make blockchains, all blockchains federated together, the value should be increased. But how we can do, who can do this? This is another important subject. So I want to highlight this governance is very important to make a balance between something evolutionary approach and revolutionary approaches.
Thank you so much. Yelena, coming back to your initial statement, what governance requests does the Vaccine Alliance, and more specifically its General Counsel, have in order to set the vision of its CEO, Dr. Berkeley, that, quote, blockchain technology could help us understand in real time all the steps taken while the vaccine is being delivered, unquote, in the practice?
So, as we know, vaccines change ownership on their journey from manufacturers to distributors, repackagers, and wholesalers. And the key is to ensure the quality of a vaccine on its journey and also availability at the service of delivery point. In that context, Gavi and Germany's KfW are exploring possible use cases in relation to supply chain. Now, what is going to be the role of legal? Certainly to ensure that what I was talking about earlier, liability is ascertained and clearly mapped out, and various legal risks are mapped out. In that context, we're most likely going to be looking at the permissioned blockchain. Now, all these things are quite a lot easier in the context of permissioned blockchain because you will typically have one entity or several entities, but certainly an identifiable entities that will be responsible for setting up the governance. Of course, then also in my mind begs the question, okay, is that entity going to be the likely go-to entity for any damages? And is that the intention of that entity, and are they comfortable with that? And also, does that perhaps bring us closer to that proverbial intermediary that the blockchain is premised on getting rid of?
Well, thank you so much. And I think that's a great point of the intermediaries, and we'll get to that in a second. But first to Jarrett. While many of the most notable cyber cases in the 19 dealt with money laundering and non-tax crimes, there is an understanding also from the IRS that future investigations will more likely show how cryptocurrencies and cyber means are being used to facilitate tax-related crimes. Keeping that in mind, what is it that blockchain can do in tackling tax-related crimes, and how does respective governance need to be designed?
Yeah, great question. So really to answer that in two aspects. One would be the way blockchain can be implemented to help stop or prevent some of this activity would be some of the ways that IRS is currently looking at utilizing blockchain in our government processes, not only in IRS but Treasury as a whole. But it focuses around identity authentication. So being able to have some type of a immutable, authenticated, verified identity up front gives us the ability to prevent some of this identity theft fraud and other type of frauds that occur. At the same time, from a criminal perspective, we as investigators are looking to certainly attack the tax fraud and the tax crimes that are occurring by utilizing blockchain and what it contains. I mean, blockchain to us is the digital bookkeeping of all financial transactions. I mean, it's most of it's open, especially when we're talking about Bitcoin. The transparency is there to be able to trace those transactions, and then to be able to make attribution on who's actually committing those types of fraud and crimes. So in that sense, it is a key aspect to our entire job of investigating wrongdoing. So I not only see the future of blockchain continuing to assist in that fashion, but being built in a fashion with governance around it that provides even more ability for law enforcement, but then also our implementation by the government to help stop some of this.
Thank you so much. So being mindful of the time that is left for this panel, let's shift gears again and get to Emmanuel and Jacep. International organizations and governmental bodies seem to be tuning into a common argument that their role is also to prevent digital islands and to remove friction and build synergies among the various stakeholders, especially through standardization. As this is conceptually not really new, and as we experience in the present quite drastically role limitations, what needs to be done differently and how for a decentralizing world? Do you want to start with that, Emmanuel?
Sure. Let me first say that the WTO is not a standard setting body. We don't set standards. So we have no vested interest in that. But what is of great concern to us when we look at the current blockchain landscape when it relates to international trade is the fact that you have all these different initiatives that pop up, all these consortia, many of them consortia, but they don't really talk to each other. So we do have, yes, a digital island problem that is exacerbated by the fact that blockchain, we use the term blockchain, but de facto we should use DLT, distributed ledger technologies. There are many different technologies. Many initiatives, for example, in the trade finance space use Corda, not all. Others in transportation logistics, some in trade finance use Hyperledger Fabric, others Quorum. So we have different technologies being used and different approaches. There's the problem of interoperability that was mentioned a little bit earlier, even though interoperability is a catch-all term. You have interoperability problems at the technical level, but also at the level of semantics. Do we all speak the same language? Is the port of unlading the same thing as the port of discharge? Interoperability at the level of data models, of processes. So there's a lot of work being required in order for these different platforms to talk to each other. So if we really want to remove frictions from international trade, we need to connect the dots and we need to make sure that we build bridges between these different platforms. We need to create a world of connected ecosystems. And right now, we don't have that. So yes, we need to work on it. Standards are one possible approach. I know that it's a word that is not very popular in the IT community for a good reason, I think, because standards does convey a notion of stiffness, and I think we need to be creative. We need to think about smart standardization. We need to talk maybe more about alignment rather than standardization per se. But we do need to work to make sure that we build bridges between these different ecosystems. So how can we do it better? I think when it comes to international trade, what is critical is that we have a cross-sectoral approach. What I see is that right now, people are still working pretty much in silos. We still have silos, but at a different level. So you have consortia dealing with trade finance. You have consortia dealing with transportation and logistics. You have some initiatives involving borders, for example, border procedures. But we need to connect the dots. So we need to have a cross-sectoral approach, and I think chain thinking is critical from end to end. You look at the entire supply chain, at all the different elements of international trade, because an international trade shipment touches upon a number of ledgers, so you can't work in isolation. And some work keeping that in mind on alignment and smart standardization, I think is critical. And this is why I've been working with the International Chamber of Commerce, which works with companies, and the WTO works with governments to try and build bridges and have a dialogue among all these different stakeholders and try to see how we could move discussions in that area, and the ICC is now taking over an initiative that was launched last year, the Universal Trade Network, on standardization, and they're now launching an initiative on digital trade standards initiative. That's how it's called. But the idea is really to foster dialogue and try to connect the dots and create a world of connected ecosystems.
So, Jacob, on connecting the dots, what's your take?
So let me take some benefit of what Emmanuel inspiring me and for encouraging me. That is a really, really big challenge for all standard organizations, especially international standard organizations. When you're hearing about this international standard, you may think about a very boring, very bureaucrat, very fixed, rigid, no flexibility at all. That's a force something. But this is our international standard community is now trying to change a lot. For example, of this now blockchain will give us how we can address of this building trust relationships. So following of this blockchains, we in ITU we had last 3 years have a very serious study on how we can adopt of these blockchains and how we can support all these blockchains. During that time, we also learning about many of our learnings. Specifically, these blockchain communities, we found two important communities. As Marta said, open source communities. It's very, very keen roles to develop blockchains. Another community is SMEs, small and medium entrepreneurs who have actually implemented those solutions to the each industry sectors. Those two communities normally, in general, outside of the international standard organizations. So issue is how we can working together with them. So last 3 years, our activities in ITU, even we are UN specialized agency with 193 member states, but we are special agency because we have more than 800 industry members, also 160 academy members. We are open platform, but we had a lot of effort how we can working together with these open source communities and the SMEs with existing international organizations and the stakeholders. So that is one of the critical examples how we can working together. We believe standard provide common platforms, common language. If you want connect the dot, even if you want federated each silo blockchains, we need a common platform. We need common language. How we can build up this common platform, common language is a challenge for our international standard organizations.
Go ahead. You got
May I
30
just add,
seconds.
20 seconds, very, very quickly. Blockchain is about collaboration, and I think what we need when you were asking about, okay, what do we need to do differently? We need to go beyond our own areas. And what I see right now is that you have many different areas, many different bodies that talk about standardization, but I think we need to do a much better job at connecting the dots between these different bodies to all work in sync in the same way.
Excellent. And with that said, finding commonalities and connecting the dots, I think next time we should have psychologists on the panels as well, because it touches upon the very human nature to sometimes not finding common ground. And with that, thank you so much for your insight. It was great to have you on the panel. And these guys are going to be available throughout the day, also in the afternoon session. So give them a big applause. Thank you so much.